As we walk through this series, if you're brand new with us, let me give you a little background. As we're walking through this series, these are questions that were asked a few weeks ago at our Easter gathering. We closed our Easter gathering by making a statement. We believe everyone is either running towards or away from the resurrection of Jesus. And when we think through that reality, we want to ask the question, if we're running away from or we feel distance is being created between you and Jesus, we want to ask the question why, and what are those questions? And if you had the opportunity to submit those questions, would you have the courage to do it? If you could do it anonymously, would you do it? And so we put a QR code on the screen. People scan the QR code and anonymously could submit questions that said, hey, these are questions I would like to have answered, that kind of go into creating barriers or obstacles from me running towards Jesus. Maybe they're obstacles for you being a person of faith altogether, or maybe they're just questions that have stopped you from taking a spiritual next step to be fully devoted in terms of being a follower of Jesus. Either way, we just said, hey, there's no question off limits. You can submit whatever question you want, and we will do our very best to figure out what those questions are, to group them together as best we can, and try to answer those over the coming weeks. And so we cleaned our teaching calendar, and week by week, we are walking through those questions. Now, I do want to give you a heads up before we get into this particular week's question. I'm going to give you a week's notice. The next week's question involves a bit of sexual conversation. And so you, for sure, if you've got kiddos next week, what it will not be is a PG conversation. So I'm not going to tiptoe around it. We're going to jump in, and I'm going to have a conversation about it. So you just know that if you've got kids, you're like, you know what, I don't know if I want them to hear this conversation. Well, then you want to probably make some adjustments next week in terms of them going upstairs, that kind of thing, to kind of make that happen. Obviously, I know there's going to be middle school students in here because we don't have a middle school thing on Sunday mornings. It's on Sunday nights. And so it'll be at least middle school friendly-ish, maybe. We'll see. Also meant to say it's not just next week, it's the next 2 weeks. Yeah, there you go. That's right. It's a part 1, part 2. How about that? There's a lot of sex happening. Here we go. Here is our question for this week, which is going to be relative to what we were going to talk about the next 2 weeks. You're probably thinking, oh, goodness. Here's our question. Here it is. I'll just go through it. Why are there so many denominations, and how do we know which one is right? Y'all took that really well. That's good. I've told a few people this week, they've asked, hey, so what's the question this week? And I'll tell them. And their reaction is like, ooh, or, oh. Anybody want to guess how many denominations there are in the United States? I'll tell you. Hey, who said 30? You're so close. I mean, kind of. It depends on your definition of close. 200. 200. Yeah. 200 denominations, right? That's 200 churches right there, I think. I think that's what that is. 200 churches. That's a bunch. Not churches, denominations, right? So if you're new and you're like, hold on, whoa, what's a denomination? Denomination is a group of churches, right? They typically have this one orthodox or one set of beliefs. And so denominations, you'll find we've got denomination across our street. There's a Methodist church across the street. Just right through this wall here, if you were just to kind of make a door there and walk outside, we would be staring at our Presbyterian friends. Both the lead pastors of both those churches have been incredible friends, super nice guys. Andrew's across the street. David is next door. Super great guys. So 2 different denominations, Presbyterian, Methodist. If you were to go right out here to Greenville Street and take a right, and go up 2 blocks and then take a left, you're going to find a Baptist church, Central Baptist Church. And if you were to go 2 blocks to the right again, you'll find another Baptist church, First Baptist Church. If you were to go through the Methodist church to the other side, you're going to find Jimmy Ellison's church, Noonan City Church. It's part of the Methodist movement, but not these type of Methodists, a different type of Methodist. There's lots, right? So denominations are like, hey, this is what we believe, and there's different types of churches, right? All over the place, right? So you might say, well, hey, well, hold on. Well, what are we, though? What are we? We are a non-denominational Christian church, right, which we're going to get into in just a second. And so I'll explain that. And so some folks might say, well, hold on. If you have a label, if you say you're non-denominational Christian church, doesn't that just mean you're a Christian church denomination? That's a great question, and one hopefully maybe I'll answer here in a few minutes. So 200 denominations in the United States. How many denominations do you think we've got worldwide? Gavin, what you think? How many? 1,000. Hey, that's again, depends on your relative definition of close. 45,000. 45,000 denominations worldwide, right? So that's not 45,000, that's 4,500, right? So the computer wouldn't do the 45,000 without them becoming teeny tiny dots. The computer was just like, we were like 45,000. It was like, no. So it would just be like a white screen, like that's it. So this times 10, that's where we're at worldwide. And so the question is, why are there so many? Like, we got one Bible, right? We talked about that at length last week. We got one Bible. Why do we have so many denominations? And how do we know which one's right? Like, how do you pick the right one out of 45,000? Let's just make it simpler. How do we pick the one out of the 200, right? 1 in 200 chance to get this thing right? Well, I want to try and walk you through this over the next few minutes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list out one by one every denomination out of the 45,000 in alphabetical order. No, she shook her head. She said, no, don't do that. Yeah, I know. You and me both. I know. Yeah, but that tells you just how big a task this is. So I'm going to do my best to walk you through a digestible version in the next 27 minutes and 21 seconds. Let's begin. It starts with just one church. It's a church in Jerusalem. Jesus was crucified. He resurrected from the dead. And a few weeks later, the church is given birth to. There's 11 guys that are present for this idea of church birth. We know them as apostles. And they begin to tell other people about this idea of a resurrected Jesus. And with that, they see a lot of growth. It happens actually fairly quickly. 3,000 people jump into this small little sect of Judaism. At least that's what everybody thought it was. Just like this little offshoot from the Jewish nation. About 3,000 people join on that very first day of the church. You fast forward a little bit, and those 3,000 people, plus the handful of folks that started it, they devoted themselves to 4 things: the fellowship, to breaking of bread, the apostles' teaching, and to prayer. And they devoted themselves to those things, and the hope was no matter where people went, people would come to Jerusalem for festivals, and they would hear about Jesus, and they would take some Jesus back. There's an account of one Ethiopian guy that's part of the royal court who has a conversation with one of those 11 guys, ends up taking Christianity back to Ethiopia, and so Christianity is spreading. There's a guy by the name of Paul. He ends up being a church planter, though he didn't start as a church planter. He started as a church persecutor. In fact, he was anti-church, anti-Christianity. He oversaw executions of Christians. He put Christians in jail. He shut little churches down all over the place. And then he had a run-in with Jesus, and that changed his life. In fact, it was such a radical transformation that most people, when they heard it, including Christians themselves, doubted it was true. Listen, there's no chance that guy has decided to plant churches instead of persecute churches. But they were wrong. It was true. It was real. And Paul started going all over these missionary journeys. And he went all over in places of Asia, all the way into Europe. And he started telling and planting these churches that were based upon this truth, this reality, that Jesus was crucified by the Romans and he resurrected from the dead. And that's how he planted churches in multiple missionary journeys all over the place. That's what he decided to do. Now, as he did this, little churches were created all over the place. When they had big questions that they didn't have answers to, they would simply write letters to him. And they would write letters to him. He would receive the letters. He would receive the questions. They would receive some of the problems that they're experiencing. And he would either go visit them himself to bring those answers or bring that instruction, or he would write a letter back. And those letters are what becomes basically the foundation of what we have in the New Testament. It's Paul corresponding with churches all over the place because he had a desire, they had a desire. There was never an assumption that these were actually independent, by themselves, do your own thing churches. But they said, no, we are a part of one huge body of believers. And this is what we want to be. This is the way the church started. The goal of the early church was unity. That is the way it began. Persecution jumped in. All of a sudden, not just people like Paul, but other people decided to persecute the church. It caused the church to spread. People took the Jesus movement with them everywhere they go to flee the persecution. And again, they would go back and they would summon the apostles. They would have questions for these church fathers and say, hey, how do we handle this situation? And they would speak into it, and the church was one. This persecution lasted for quite some time, and not just like a generation or two, but for a couple of 100 years. So much so that there's an edict that's given in 313 AD by Constantine, the Edict of Milan, which says, hey, Christianity is now legal. We're not going to persecute them anymore. We're actually going to allow them to practice without persecution. We're not going to kill them. We're not going to put them in jail. So it took a couple 100 years for us to get to a place where still a unified Christianity is not persecuted. We fast forward about 10, 12 years, and we get to a place where we now are seeing that the church, when they have questions, these apostles, Paul, they're long gone. And so there's not an opportunity to write letters and do this. And so what they do is they begin to get religious leaders from very specific cities that are big hubs of Christianity from all over the world, and they bring them together to do Bible study and have conversations about big questions. They call them councils. This first really big council is called the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Again, a very unified front in all of Christendom. With this, we get what is known today as the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is a summary of what the church believed. Obviously, the Bible is a really huge, thick book, and if you have to read all of it, there's a lot of in and outs and putting things together. And so they said, hey, can we just do like a summary of statement and beliefs? And so they create this creed that talks about a resurrected Jesus and a crucified Jesus and how this whole thing works. And they say, hey, this is like a summary of what the Bible has taught us, what these letters of Paul have taught us. And they give us that. We fast forward about 60 years to the Edict of Thessalonica. For about 60 years, Christianity has now been legal. And in 380 AD, the Edict of Thessalonica makes Christianity the national religion for the Roman Empire. Again, the church is still one. The very next year, the Council of Constantinople in 381. They gather together, again, this council of church leaders from various cities. And they come together and they confirm what the Nicene Creed said. They said, hey, we're going to confirm the Nicene Creed. We're going to affirm what it says in that. And around this time, they begin to give some special honor to the leaders of the churches in those major cities. Now, we said, hey, these hubs of Christianity had started. These cities are Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And those 5 cities made up the hubs of Christianity. And there were large church leaders or church fathers, bishops is what they would have called them, that kind of oversaw the churches in those cities. And so they would send the delegates and the leaders together to have some conversation about these really big questions. And so this special honor begins to be given to these 5 cities. That takes us to AD 451. Again, still a unified Christianity. To the Council of Chalcedon. This big question that's talked about here at this council, this meeting of this leadership, is about the question, is Jesus God or is Jesus man? And which one is he? And so they begin to pour through the scriptures and they're asking the question like, hey, what is he? Is he kind of like God or is he like fully man? What we get from this is a very theological term, which you may or may not have heard before, called the hypostatic union. It means that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. It's the way we wrap our minds around the reality of Jesus that's revealed to us in the scriptures. That Jesus has all the characteristics that are true of a person and all the characteristics that are true of divine being. Both natures fully exist in one, the hypostatic union. Now, this decision that's made that kind of says, hey, this is how we explain what we see and study in Scripture. Up until now, like when these decisions are made at councils, people are like, yes, we trust this. This is good. This decision creates a little tension. It creates tension between churches in the East and churches in the West. Around this same time, there's a pope named Pope Leo I. Now, the pope at this particular time is not the head of the entire church. At this time, there's 5 hubs of Christianity, And in those 5 hubs, there's a bishop, or at this point, they'll call the one in Rome Pope. And they were on equal playing field. Like, all right, if you're going to lead a church, all 5 of them have equal say. All 5 of them are on the same page. Pope Leo the first begins to claim out loud authority over the whole church on the basis of him being located in the city of Rome. And we're like, well, what does Rome have to do with this whole thing? Well, I mean, it's the capital of the Roman Empire. That's important. But beyond that, the idea is that Peter and Paul died in Rome. Both of them were executed. They still have the bones of Peter and Paul. In fact, the bones of Peter, from a Catholic perspective, still sit in St. Peter's Basilica. I mean, they got this little box. And like, hey, that's Peter's bones. I don't know. That's what they say. And so they're like, hey, hold on, I'm a direct leader of the church that Peter started in Rome, right? Like this is a big deal. And so because of that apostolic succession, then we should have a little more weight or authority than anyone else. Now, it's not like a done deal, but it's like this is what begins to be said. And this creates a lot of tension. We fast forward about 500 years to 1054. And we get to a place in church history called the Great Schism. Now, there's a few issues that lead to this huge schism. The first one is a language barrier. In the West, the Roman church, they started learning and using the language of Latin. It's why a lot of times the Roman church will be called the Latin church. And so everything that they did when they studied the scriptures was Latin. They wrote commentaries in Latin. They studied Latin. They spoke Latin. It was a higher learning language. Now, the churches in the East, and Constantinople was kind of the head of it, the churches there were Greek. And so when they started to come together to ask these really difficult questions, they were bringing different resources together in different languages. And the folks in the East were like, hey, we don't read Latin. And they were like, well, you should. And they're like, well, but we don't, and we don't want to. And why can't you read Greek? You always read Greek. But now for these last couple hundred years, you got this Latin thing. And they're like, yeah, because it's a superior language. And it's like, well, hold on. Jesus didn't speak Latin. He was like, yeah, well, he should have. Like, they're going back and forth. And so there's a language barrier that exists when they start having this conversation. The second issue, in addition to language barrier, is the bread they use during communion. In the West, Rome wanted to use unleavened bread, and in the East, in Constantinople, they wanted to use bread with yeast. The Eastern tradition said, hey, look, yeast in bread is like the soul in the body. It brings it to life. And the Roman church, the church in the West, said, yeah, but Jesus used unleavened bread, so shouldn't we just use what Jesus used? And they didn't agree. They also had an issue with the Nicene Creed, which when I say this, you're like, hold on, isn't it 1054? Didn't the Nicene Creed happen in the early 300s, like 700 years ago? And hadn't they confirmed it just like a little bit later? And hasn't that been like a thing? Like, yeah, yeah. But they started having issues about it. And they started having issues about how it was worded and what it said. Fourth issue, this would have been my issue, the celibacy of the clergy. In the West, okay? Y'all gonna love next week. Guarantee my wife's not coming to church next week. I mean, you never know. I believe in miracles. The West, the church in Rome said, no, all clergy must be celibate. And the church in the East, in Constantinople, said, hey, not everybody does. Like okay, the top leaders, we'll make them be celibate. But the lower leaders, they don't have to be celibate. They don't have to go through that. And they disagreed. If I for sure would be Team Constantinople, and I would have printed shirts everywhere, and I would have sold shirts to all my clergy friends saying, hey, Team Constantinople. Yeah. A fifth issue is the authority of the Pope. In the West, in Rome, they believed that the Pope was the religious leader of the entire church. And in the East, in Constantinople, they said, no, all of us are equal in how we do this from the cities. And here's the result. On July 16th, 1054, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, I get his name every time, Cerularius, was excommunicated from the Christian church in the West, in Rome. And in retaliation, the Church of the East in Constantinople excommunicated Pope Leo IX and the entire Roman Catholic Church. Not just the Pope, all y'all. I'm sure they didn't put everybody's name on a list, but they were just like, anybody who's ever been and listened to that man, gone. You can't come to church anymore. The resulting split divided the Christian church into two major branches: Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Great Schism, 1054. Now, from here forward, for sure I can't go into the Eastern Orthodox piece because it doesn't really affect the United States all that much. Eastern Orthodox Church is still going incredibly strong. There are still pieces here in the United States, but it's very teeny tiny. Eastern Orthodox Church is enormous, and I'm sure if somebody's watching from the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's a big deal, right? So I'm not trying to downplay it at all. I'm just saying in terms of how I'm going to explain what we got next to us and across the street and what we're doing here, it doesn't come from the Eastern Orthodox Church. So it splits. We're going to continue down the line of this Western or Roman Catholic Church. This is the way it is. It's just split, left and right, or east and west. That's the way it's split for about 500 years. So the Middle Ages span from 500 to 1500. During this time, the Catholic Church dominated society. They had a pope that oversaw the entire religion, and in each city it had a local priest. The local priest had so much influence. He was the only person that could read the Bible. No one else spoke Latin or read Latin. If you had a question about the Bible, you had to go to your local priest. You didn't have a Bible to actually read for yourself. And even if you did, you didn't read Latin. It wasn't printed in your language. It was just Latin. So if you had any biblical question, you had to go to him. That same local priest is the one that christened you when you were born. He heard your confessions as you grow up. He married you. He then heard your confessions after he married you. He performed your last rites. He officiated your funeral, your dad's funeral, your granddad's funeral, your aunt's and uncle's funeral. All those people, he was involved in every single one of their lives at every big milestone. The Catholic Church owned a third of all the land. They were everywhere, which is the setting for what happens on October 31st, 1517. A monk by the name of Martin Luther came across a Catholic representative in a small city that was selling pieces of paper that were signed by Catholic officials. This piece of paper is known today as an indulgence. And on the indulgence, it said that if you gave such and such a money, then you could shorten the time of purgatory or suffering for people after you died. And so they were going around selling these things. You could actually sell one, and it would be retroactive to people that had already died. Like they're sitting there suffering, but if you will buy it, just magically, when they hand you the piece of paper, boom, they poof out of purgatory and they go to the next good place, right? That's what was happening. Now, it wasn't like they were selling these pieces of paper for like $1, $1.50. They were selling them for like a half year's wages. But as you're thinking, remember, they can't read the Bible. It's not written in their language. And so if they've got a question about what happens after you die, or they want to check someone, they've got nothing. They can go to their local priest and say, hey, so what happens? And then whatever he tells them has to be the truth. Whatever he tells them, it just must be. There's no way to double check anything. There is no internet. There is no Googles. There's no handheld Bibles. People don't walk around with them in their phone in their pocket or in their purse. There's not even those fancy Bible covers with the flowers you get on them. There's nothing. There's none of that. And so all they get is, you know what? Your grandmama was a smart mouth. I bet she's suffering in purgatory. Like, no, not grandmama. I'm like, yeah, grandmama. And then all of a sudden you are forking over half a year's wages. Because goodness, she gave you everything. Why would you not do this small thing for her? Martin Luther saw this, and so he said, hey, we got to make a change. When Martin Luther started this, he wasn't trying to start something new. He was trying to reform something that was really old. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther published a document called The Disputation on the Power of Indulgences, or as we know it today as the 95 Thesis. Now, when he published this 95 Thesis, it was an invitation to have debate over the principles that he shared in this document. It wasn't to say, hey, rip this whole thing down, burn it to the ground, let's just start something new. It was, hey, there's some things I want to bring to everyone's attention, and I would like to open it up for some discussion and debate amongst leaders. However, they took that and said, sure, let's have an open discussion. It turned into a trial, and Martin Luther lost. Not just a little bit lost, a lot of it lost. So much so, he had to go into hiding. That's how bad he lost. A German royal individual gave him a space in his castle to hide. And he was there for a number of years. And while he was there, he decided, there's no chance I'm going to reform the leadership in the Catholic Church. So what I need to do is I need to translate the Bible into a language that anyone can read. And so that's what he did. So he started to translate the Bible into the German language, an everyday common man's language, hoping to initiate reform. So from the Protestant Reformation, we have a number of denominations that you would likely recognize. We have the Lutheran, the Anglican, the Reformed, and the Anabaptist. Now, the Lutheran was started by Martin Luther, started in Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And again, it wasn't to replace the Catholic Church. That wasn't the idea, but it ends up being a completely different denomination. The Anglican Church, or the Anglican denomination, it started, Martin Luther really gave enough courage for everyone to follow through on what they were thinking already. It's not like the Anglican started because Lutheran started, but Luther gave them enough courage to do something. The Anglican Church was started by Henry VIII, who was the King of England, who had a wife, it was his first wife, and she wasn't producing the son that he wanted her to, and evidently that was all her fault. I don't know, he would die in biology class now when he realizes that's his fault. But either way, sure stem on the apple, kid. But at the end of the day, he was like, hey, look, I want a divorce. If she can't give me what I want a divorce. So he asked the Pope, he was like, hey, I need a divorce. Will you please grant me a divorce? And he was like, no, that's not what we do in marriage. We don't just divorce people because they can't have boys. Like, that's not how we do things. And he was like, it's how I want to do things and I'm the king. And he was like, well, that's not how we're doing it because I'm the Pope. And like marriage is my thing, right? It's not your thing, it's my thing, it's God's thing. That's not how we do it. And he says, fine, I don't need your permission. I'll start my own church. And that's what he did. So he started the Church of England, also now known as the Anglican Church. And so with that, we got two. We got the Lutheran Church, we got the Anglican Church, and then we have the Reformed movement. There's a name you'll probably recognize named John Calvin that creates this or helps start this Reform movement. It's also known as Calvinist or Calvinism. The key belief there is that God elects who he will save, and if you are not elected, you will not be saved. And all of that is up to God, has nothing to do with you recognizing Jesus or discovering Jesus. If you recognize or discover Jesus, it's because God chose you to recognize or discover Jesus. There was also a guy named John Knox in Scotland. And in Scotland, he started the denomination that's just through our wall back here, the Presbyterian Church. And so the Presbyterian Church came right out of the Reformed denomination. And then we have the fourth, the Anabaptists. Now, these Anabaptists are not like the Baptists that you know. They're completely different, though they do share that name Baptist. Anabaptists, the only thing they did have in common with the Baptists you know today is that they rejected the idea that infants should be baptized in favor of the notion that baptism was reserved for adult Christians. Right? So that we have those four denominations that come from it, right? We've got Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, which also gives us Presbyterian and Anabaptist. That takes us from the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s up to the 1700s, starting in 1730. We get to something that we know today in church history called the First Great Awakening. Now, in the First Great Awakening is when we begin to see the Baptists that you know today come onto the scene. However, the Baptists technically started in the 1600s, but it was so tiny, most people didn't even recognize that it was a movement that was happening. In the First Great Awakening in the 1700s is when it really kind of came onto the scene. In fact, it started really tiny, it started as an offshoot of the Anglican Church in the 1600s, but again, it was so small, no one noticed it until the 1730s. However, there was a congregation in the state of Rhode Island in 1638, and that building is still there today. It's the First Baptist Church of the United States. How about that? And so you're wondering, like, why do we call everything First Baptist? Well, it's First Baptist United States. Now it's First Baptist Noonan, First Baptist Sharpsburg. I don't know, all the things. First Baptist, lots of First Baptists. Now, the Baptists, when they begin in this first Great Awakening, it's the first beginning of what's known today as the evangelical movement, which brings an enormous concentration, I guess, or what's another word? Significance, places a lot of significance on the personal conversion experience, right? And that's this idea, this personal conversion experience is this evangelical movement. This is in contrast to a more liturgical movement, which is based on rituals, like formalized symbolic actions and ceremonies that the church is really known for up until this time. The Baptists start introducing like this completely different approach, like, hey, what are you doing personally with Jesus, which is a really great thing. Now, with that, there's some name changes. They start with the particular Baptist and the general Baptist, and eventually they come together and they call themselves the Triennial Baptist. Then they change their name to the Missionary Baptist, and then a little branch shoots off of them, and we know them today as the Primitive Baptists, and the most famous of those is Westboro Baptist, which has lots of fun signs that aren't all that fun. If you have no idea, just don't Google it. Actually, just save yourself. It's a lot of hate. From there, we then finally get to the Baptists you know today. In the Civil War, Baptists split, and we have now Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists because of the cause of slavery. Also, in the First Great Awakening, the Methodist Church begins. This comes from the Anglican Church. John Wesley, his brother, and a guy named George Whitefield went to Oxford, and while they were at Oxford, they created something called the Holy Club. And in the Holy Club, which sounds a lot of fun, they decided, hey, we want to take the principles of Jesus and figure out how do we incorporate those methodically into every aspect of our life. And just like they were obsessed with it so much that other students began making fun of them, and they started calling them Methodists, and the name stuck. So here's our summary so far. We had one church. Paul helped plant, and apostles helped answer questions to bring unity. Eventually, we have 5 hubs for a unified Christianity: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. It's that way until 1054 in the Great Schism, when the church splits into East and West, and the Roman Catholicism is born. In the 1500s, Lutheran says, hey, we've got to reform this. The result of that is 4 denominations, really a 5th start: Lutheran, Anglican, Reformed, which gives us Presbyterian, and the Anabaptists, which are not the Baptists you know today. And then we get to the 1700s, where the First Great Awakening happens. That's when the Baptist you do know today takes off. And the Methodists happen from the Anglicans as well. And now we get to the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s here in the United States. The First Great Awakening that happened just about 70, 80 years earlier, was a bunch of Christians waking up to the reality that things needed to change. The Second Great Awakening, though, is not only Christians waking up to the reality that things need to change, it's also new converts to Christianity in mass. Like thousands upon thousands of people decide, I'm not following Jesus, and now I'm going to follow Jesus. We know this today as the Restoration Movement. You see, the Restoration Movement is different than the Reformation movement, reform being the key word in the Reformation. Restoration is a movement that says, I think church has lost its way. We should go back to the way it was in the beginning. There was a man in 1804 named Barton W. Stone, a Presbyterian pastor, that said, I don't want to be Presbyterian anymore. Not because Presbyterian's bad, but I just want to do the very best I can to do things like the Bible says and nothing else. In 1811, Thomas Campbell, also a Presbyterian pastor, says the same thing. The followers of Barton W. Stone, his followers become known as Christians. And the followers of Thomas Campbell become known as disciples of Christ. And in 1832, those two movements realized they were doing the exact same thing, and so they combined together. And for about 70 years, it worked really well until we got to 1906. and then there was a huge division. When you think about division in the church, we've talked about things that have kind of added to this. We've talked about the authority of the Pope. We've talked about selling get-out-of-hell-free cards and how that's not good. We've talked about baptism and communion. All of those things are really important things that you should have a conversation about. And I can see how, man, if you get on one side or the other, we might just say, hey, you know what, I don't know if I can agree to disagree on this thing. However, in 1906, there was something even bigger, at least in their minds. The church split over whether or not we should use instruments in worship or not. You can see where we fall. And so that created the non-instrumental Church of Christ, or just the Christian church. I want to pause here for a second before we close. And I want to make sure that you know that I don't know who asks these questions, but I want you to know that you really do deserve an answer. And I'm also very self-aware to know in the last 27 minutes, I haven't answered where we got 45,000 denominations from. But my hope is that I've at least got it started so you can see kind of the DNA of how these things begin. And so with this answer, I also want to recommend a resource that we have available today. This is created in a way for people that are learning to really take a look. It's not an in-depth resource where when you look at these charts and graphs and kind of timelines that it's going to give you enormous papers explaining it all, but it does give you the overall highlights of how it works. And I think it's a really good start for those of you who are interested in looking at church history. It's just called that, church history. And it's got timelines and charts and lists, and it goes into a lot of detail. This page is on the Italian Renaissance figures and their relationship to the church. And so it walks through all of those. It talks about the prominence or the beginning of women working in and through the church. It's got a long list of missionaries and where they went and how it spread, not just like the Paul side of things, but even into recent history. This one says medieval mysticism, and so it walks through all of those things that were happening in that medieval time. It's just got everything that you can think of. All the councils I mentioned, plus all the small ones. It talks about what they're called, what was decided at those councils, and what influence it had on the church. And so it's a really great resource that if you're interested in that kind of thing, we wanted to make sure we had available today. And so there's some hard copies that we ordered off Amazon this week. They're $20, and so you can pick those up in the lobby right outside. I did have a debate with a staff member or two about whether or not y'all would be interested in these things, and so I made a bet that these would sell out today. We'll see, I guess, who's right in just a little bit. The 9 o'clock underperformed for me a little bit, so Brooke Buchanan might have been right. I thought it was a great resource. So we want to make sure that you have availability of these. And again, we're charging just what Amazon does. If you want to grab your own, we've got a QR code outside that takes you right to the Amazon place to purchase it. So let's close. When we ask that question, hey, where do all the denominations come from? I hope I've given you a little bit of that answer. However, I think the second part of the question might be even better and probably the most important thing we're going to talk about today, which is, so which one is right? We got 45,000 to choose from, 200 here in the United States. So which one is right? Of course, the answer is, well, we are, right? No, the answer is none of them. Not a single one. Not a single one. Every single one of us have missed what the church is really supposed to be. And we might have glimpses of it that appears in our sharpest moments. And we might just catch just a little just a little glimpse of what Jesus really wants from the church on our best days. But the truth is, just as humanity has fallen short, so has the church. In fact, the church itself must be redeemed. It's not just our hearts. Jesus is coming back for his bride, for the church. The church also is broken. Now, do I think we do the very best we can given our best and worst days? That's what I hope. That's what I pray. But I will tell you that this separation, this division that exists on Sunday mornings, and for some traditions on Saturday mornings, it's definitely not by accident. When we look at the life of Jesus, it's about to come to a close. Jesus knows he's about to go to the cross, and he's spending some time in prayer. And we actually have an opportunity, because of one of his closest friends that's with him, this prayer is recorded. John tells us about this prayer of Jesus just moments before the cross. He says, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message." Now, to make sure we understand what's happening here, because I'm going to read you the whole prayer, he's talking about the disciples that are with him, John and the rest of the boys, right? They're all there. There's 11 of them there hanging out, that kind of thing. He said, hey, this is my prayer for them. And in addition to those guys, his really close friends, he also says, it's not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. And so not only is Jesus praying for those boys that are there, his really close friends, Jesus is praying for you and me in this. Because it's through their message that we believe. Jesus is making a global declaration and prayer as he begins to walk through the reality of his own death, because he knows he's about to go to the cross. And as he prepares himself, his first thought is, there are so many people that I will help create that have yet to know my name, and I want to pray for them. And so what is his prayer? Verse 21, that all of them may be one, Father. Just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. He prays for two things. He says, I want them to be one. I want not just these boys here. I want these boys to be one, but I also want all of the people that come to know Jesus through their message. I want them to be one. And how does he want them to be one? He says, I want them to be one in Christ. I want them to be connected to who I am, connected to the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. I want them to be connected to me, connected to the Father, and connected to one another. I want them to be one. He continues, verse 22. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Jesus is praying, and he's praying to his Father. It's fully God and fully man praying to God. And in that moment, he thinks about us. And what is his desire for us? Unity. Unity. That we would be together. That we would be one. Now, I started this whole part by saying that this wasn't an accident, that we're all separated. I'll tell you, let me just be a little vulnerable for a second. I'll just be honest with you. I can't tell you how many times that I have prayed something. And that as Satan listens to my prayers, that Satan didn't say, oh yeah, God, please give him exactly what he's asking for. Please answer that prayer. Please tell him yes. But you know what has never happened? There's never been a moment when Jesus prays to God and asks for something that Satan says, oh yeah, please answer his prayer. You see, Jesus praying for unity, the enemy listens to that prayer, and his response is, please, no. Because what are the stakes, right? The stakes are, if we could become one, if we were unified, then the entire world would know that Jesus was sent by God. That's enormous. That's the result of unity. That if we could pull that off, the whole world would know that Jesus was sent by God. Well, you might be wondering, like, well, why is that the result of unity? Because you know how hard it is to bring people across geopolitical lines? Do you know how hard it is to break language barriers? Do you know how hard it is to break customs and culture barriers? Do you know how hard it is to be friends with your neighbor across the street that goes to a different denomination and thinks differently about things than you do? Do you know how hard it is to be friends with someone who doesn't vote like me? Right? All of those things, as we start looking through it, it's like, oh goodness, do you know how hard people are? I mean, I've got a bumper sticker on the back of my car that says people / ooh, right? I don't, but I've seen them, Like, yeah. This makes sense. And so Satan all the while is like, schism, let's go. Great schism. That wasn't enough. East and West isn't enough. Let's break it into 5. Let's take those 5 to 25 and 25 to 25,000. Can I get some more denominations, please? Can I get one on every block, in every place? Get them all. We like denominations. The more divided you are, the more the world questions, why can't those Christians get it together? Now, this is adult talk now. It might be Satan's play, but we're the one that's executing it. Our church at Foundation, we have attempted to model what it looks like to create a You Belong Here movement. Which means that, contrary to a lot of movements that I was a part of prior to planting Foundation, we do an enormous amount of interaction that's cross-denominational. If David or Andrew were to call and say, hey, I need your help with something, my answer is going to be, yeah, of course. Yeah, we'll figure this out with you. We'll figure this out. Now, there are enormous theological differences in terms of what we study the Bible and where we arrive on some pretty important things that separate. That's why the denominations exist, because there's differences in how we see things. Enormous things. But the truth is that every single one of us are still chasing down a crucified and resurrected Jesus of Nazareth. And so that is powerful enough to overcome the things that honestly do divide our thoughts. And it also puts us in a place that the resurrection and death of Jesus is so powerful. It allows us to sit in tension and study the Bible with people that we might disagree with. Because Jesus is so powerful, we have the opportunity to sit in that tension and say, you know what? Here's the thing. Where we do agree is the most important person that ever walked the planet was a real person. He really died in the first third of the first century under Roman rule as a result of religious Judaism influence. And 3 days later, on that first Sunday of the week, he resurrected from the dead with a physical body. The feet that hung on the cross, were nailed to the cross, walked out on the ground of the grave. And that is powerful enough to bring us to tables to have conversations and solve community problems and to work together. While we might have some different theological issues, that is powerful enough to bring some unity. It's why we support nonprofits that would say, I'm not affiliated with anything in church, because they're doing good in the community, and we would love to get behind people who do good things for our community. We're not selling out the gospel or Jesus or any of those things. We're simply saying, look, if we can be a helping hand, we want to say yes. You know, I want to say we we model what we want to be as a church. But I'll tell you this, the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a couple of really hard conversations where just in this room, there's probably some disagreement. And we will see if the reality of Jesus is powerful enough for us to sit in tension as we walk through some really important truths. You Belong Here movements take a lot of work. It's not easy. But when I look at what Foundation continues to become, I'll give you a small snapshot. It's people who have voted for Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Donald Trump and George W. Bush and Barack Obama. It's people that grew up Anglican or Methodist or Catholic or Baptist. It's people that come from a diverse background and life experiences. It's people who see social issues completely different from one another. It's people who might, according to what you see on TV, should hate one another and blame one another for the rise or fall of America. But that's not what happens here in these walls. And these walls, the resurrection and death of Jesus is more powerful than everything I just mentioned. Every denomination gets on their knees in front of Jesus. Every political party gets on their knees in front of Jesus. And every social movement gets on their knees in front of Jesus and says, "You're king. You're king." He's powerful enough to bring unity among division. And Foundation is shaping up to be an incredible picture of the power of Jesus. We're going to walk through these next couple of weeks, which might be a little tense. We're going to walk through an entire political series as we get closer to the election this year, to walk through what's a Jesus ethic in the midst of such divisive time. And we're going to just lay it all out there. Not in terms of how you should vote or what those things, but in terms of what are Jesus' expectations for you. And we're going to do that through the hard work of the You Belong Here movement. And you know what will happen if we do a good job with that? The world will look at what happens here at Foundation and say, Jesus must actually be legit if they can bring those sides together. It's almost like Jesus knew what he was talking about. I love to be a part of being an answer to the prayer of my Savior. How cool is that? I've always asked Jesus to answer my prayers. And he gives us an opportunity to help answer his.